Hey guys, and thank you for choosing to stay with me tonight. In this video, we will begin a strange and wondrous journey not to the pyramids, but to the stone corridors, where prayers echo amidst the scent of incense and sunlight streaming through towering columns. This is the story of the ancient Egyptian healers, men and women, who healed not only with medicine, but with dreams, with their hands, and with the deep belief that healing is the most sacred act one human can offer to another. If you are someone who enjoys slow, vivid, and emotional storytelling, where history does not come across as dry facts, but flows into the heart like a midnight breeze, then do consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video, but only if you truly feel a connection to what I am creating here. And if you have a moment, leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you are. Every time I read those messages, I feel something magical, like this ancient story is traveling across the world, reaching every corner, every pair of headphones in the stillness of the night. Now dim the lights, turn on a small fan, take a deep breath, and come with me into the first night of Egypt, where a gentle touch on the forehead was more than a diagnosis. It was a whisper from the gods. Have you ever heard of a place where illness was considered a whisper from the gods? Long before hospital syringes and the cold glow of operating rooms. How did humankind heal one another? Before medicine donned the white coat, there existed a civilization that listened to the heartbeat through prayer, treated wounds with flowers and herbs, and diagnosed illnesses through dreams. Tonight, as everything around you quiets down, let me take you into a world both ancient and alive as breath itself, the world of healers on the banks of the Nile more than 3,000 years ago. Imagine yourself standing on a golden sand dune. In front of you lies the Nile River, flowing silently as if murmuring secrets in a language only wind and time can understand. In the distance, towering temple roofs glow red beneath the sunset, where massive stone columns shaped like lotus flowers cast long shadows across the earth. This is not a land of metal and machines. This is a realm of symbols, fragrances, music, and sacred prayers. And in this realm, ancient Egypt, healing was not a profession. It was a ritual. The Egyptians believed that illness was not merely about bleeding broken bones or a fever. It was a sign of imbalance between man and the cosmos, the soul and the body, the gods and the mortal. When someone fell ill, no one asked, "Where does it hurt?" before asking, "What have you done to make the gods turn away?" Thus, the first place the sick turned to was not the physician, but the temple. Temples were steeped in the scents of resin and frankincense, where light filtered through stone curtains, creating shimmering patterns on the floor like rippling water. There the Sunnu, priest-physicians, moved gracefully in linen robes carrying papyrus scrolls inscribed with remedies and sacred rites passed down through generations. When a person fell ill, they were not simply examined, but purified. A bowl of Nile water was offered to the gods as incense smoke rose in the shape of a serpent, a symbol of rebirth. The healer would place a hand on the patient's forehead not to check for fever, but to feel the discord in the soul's rhythm. It was not just about prayers. The Egyptians understood the body more deeply than we might think. They knew how to cleanse wounds with wine. They knew that honey could prevent infections. They had no stethoscopes yet. They possessed extraordinary insight and precision in observation. They listened to the language of plants. They knew which oil soothed burning skin, which mineral stopped bleeding, and which flower could lull pain to sleep. But whether it was a salve or a potion, every treatment was accompanied by a prayer. For without divine consent, even if the wound healed, the soul might still ache. As you walked past a healing temple, you might hear the slow chanting of sacred incantations. You would see the sick lying on mats of reeds in the central hall, hoping that a dream might bring them the cure. They called it the healing dream, where the gods whispered remedies into your ear while you slept. Thoth, the ibis-headed god, was the deity of wisdom and medicine, believed to have written the first books on healing kept in the temple's hidden vaults. And Sekhmet, with fiery eyes and a lioness's head, was both the cause and the cure of all plagues. When enraged, she brought calamity to the land. But when appeased through the proper rites, she bestowed strength, rebirth, and life itself. All of this, from a fingertip cut to a pain buried deep in the mind, was healed by blending the sacred with the tangible, by uniting humble science with grand belief. And within that union, the Egyptians laid the foundation for what we now call medicine. You see, history is not only written through wars or thrones, it is also written through a bowl of holy water, a dream of renewal, and the gentle hands of someone who believed that healing is the most sacred act one human can offer another. A place where people dreamed of remedies and the gods healed in silence. In the towering stone temples of Egypt, where sunlight pierced through columns like golden blades slicing the air, the sick were not merely cared for, they were listened to. Not with ears alone, but with a profound stillness, a kind of attention found only in worlds that have never forgotten the presence of the soul. But healing in that place was never easy. For what we call illness, to them, might have been a warning from the goddess Sekhmet. You would never utter her name lightly. In the faded carvings on temple walls, Sekhmet appears with eyes of fire and the head of a lioness, at once destruction and final hope. They believed that when she grew angry, plagues swept through the land like sandstorms. But she too, if calmed, was the only one who could bring about rebirth. In difficult times, when someone fell ill without explanation, no fever, no wounds, just a slow fading of the light in their eyes, the Sunnu did not rush to knives or medicine. They began with quiet rituals, anointing the statue of a god with fragrant oil, burning incense made from desert resins, whispering prayers beside a bowl of water. Ordinary water, but when named with the divine, it became sacred. The patient would be allowed to sleep within the temple itself. There were no electric lights, only the faint flicker of oil lamps glowing like stars on a cave ceiling. It was believed that when night descended and the other world opened, the gods would step into one's dreams to deliver a remedy or a revelation. Imagine you were that patient, lying on a mat of reeds, your back aching, your mind adrift. You did not know why your strength was fading. No physician had found an answer. All you knew was that for weeks now you had heard strange whispers in the wind, and in your dreams a lion-headed goddess walked through a field ablaze with red. The next morning, a Sunnu would sit beside you. He would not ask, "Did you sleep well?" but would gently say, "What did you see?" In that world, dreams were guidance. Every symbol held meaning. Falling from a height, you might be losing divine protection. Drowning, your soul might be overwhelmed by repressed emotions. It was not superstition, but a way for humans to look deeply within themselves, aided by a sacred web of symbols and meditative rituals stretching back millennia. Alongside these rites were people of flesh and blood. One of them was Imhotep, a real figure in history who lived over 4,000 years ago. Once merely a scribe, he became an architect, a physician, and was later revered as a god of medicine. The Egyptians did not confuse mythology with reality. They understood that some individuals were so extraordinary that after death, their wisdom could not be left to memory alone. It had to be enshrined in temples and prayers, in tiny statues placed beside the beds of the ill. Inside the temple archives, where sunlight barely reached and the air carried the scent of incense and papyrus, fragile scrolls were guarded as treasures. One of them is known today as the Ebers Papyrus, more than 65 feet long or about 20 meters, containing hundreds of remedies from minor cuts to mental distress, from shortness of breath to insomnia. You might assume these were merely ancient notes, but as you read them, you can feel the precision, the care, and the lived experience in every line. One passage describes treating asthma by burning herbs on hot stones and inhaling the vapor. Another outlines symptoms resembling diabetes with startling clarity. And then, amid the medical instructions, a note suddenly appears. Draw this symbol on the patient's skin before applying the remedy. Or repeat this phrase 3 times while grinding onion with honey. Because for them, healing was a union of craftsmanship and spirit. Every wound was not just mechanical, it was a whisper from the cosmos. You see, our times may have changed, but the vulnerability of humans in the face of pain, in the face of unanswered questions, has never really changed. Today, we have MRI machines and algorithms. Yet there are still moments when all we truly need is someone to place a hand gently on our forehead and ask with the softest voice, "What did you dream of?" The third doorway along the journey down the Nile, where the blade is a ritual and wounds are stitched with trust. A place where a wound was never just blood, but a test of the healer's courage and the patient's faith. Imagine yourself standing inside a quiet stone chamber deep within the temple of Karnak. There are no harsh fluorescent lights, only the soft glow of a bowl of glowing embers and the scent of melting honey mingled with resin drifting slowly through the air. Upon a stone table, a young man lets out a quiet moan. A deep slash along his forearm has torn through his bronze skin, the wound still bleeding hours after returning from the battlefield. There is no shouting, no sirens. Only an older man, his silver hair tied back, gently dipping a linen cloth into a bowl of fermented grape wine, an antiseptic used for thousands of years before antibiotics ever existed. He wears no white coat, only a hand-embroidered linen robe, but at his waist, instead of a stethoscope, hang bronze hooks, carved blades, and clay jars sealed with beeswax. This is a Sunnu, not merely a healer, but a guardian at the threshold between life and death. People often mistake ancient medicine as primitive superstitious. But if you were in that room, you would sense the care each movement considered as deliberately as a ceremonial dance. No carelessness, no guesswork, only stillness, and a strange kind of faith in one's hands. The wound is cleansed with honey, not for its sweetness, but for its natural antibacterial power. Then, pure white linen soaked in lotus oil is wrapped around the arm like ribbons in a festival. For the Egyptians, even bandaging was a form of blessing. But not every wound yields so easily. Once a child was brought into the temple after falling from high stone steps. His arm was twisted, bruised, the pain so intense he could not cry, only gasped as if something were squeezing his chest. His mother knelt beside him, clutching a string of beads shaped like the goddess Isis. While others prayed, the Sunnu said nothing. He gently took the arm and placed it upon a thin wooden board, already tied with leather straps. There was no anesthesia, no numbing injection, only a piece of mandrake root crushed and mixed with wine, just enough to blur the senses. And then, when the moment was right, he reset the shoulder with a swift motion, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. The child cried out, then fell silent. His breathing slowed. His mother's hands trembled, and the healer simply placed his palm on the boy's forehead, whispering something no one could hear. In that moment, you understand he was not just mending a bone. He was healing fear. In that land, technique and spirit could not be separated. A cut was never just a cut. It was a leak in the order of things, a door through which chaotic forces could enter the body. And so, after every bandage came a prayer. After every flow of blood was stopped, a name of a god was called. Even when necrotic tissue had to be cut away or an abscess drained, it was never done in silence. A chant was always present, partly to steady the patient's heart, partly to ask that the act not offend the gods. Sometimes they would use fire to seal a wound, cauterization, a way to close not only the flesh, but the energy that had escaped with it. You might wonder, did it hurt terribly? The answer is yes. But they did not pass through the pain alone. There was always a hand on their forehead, a gaze unflinching, a song soft as breath sung into the ear. And in those moments, healing was no longer a skill, it was a presence. Perhaps that is what modern medicine has begun to forget. We have technology, we have medicine, we have everything. And yet perhaps what we long for most is still the gaze of someone like that Sunnu, one who does not see you as a case, but as a soul searching for its way back to its original state balance. The fourth doorway along the banks of the Nile, where every leaf carries the memory of the gods, a place where time flows more slowly and memory breathes through incense and desert wind. If the previous doors were about dreams healing hands and wounds, then this one is about a chest not filled with gold or silver, but with leaves. Yet not all leaves are the same. Some were picked under the full moon. Some seeds were mixed with water from sacred wells. Some blossoms had to be placed beside a protective amulet before being crushed. To the ancient Egyptians, nature was not a resource. It was the living memory of the universe. In the shaded courtyards of temples, where small gardens were carefully tended by apprentices, every bush, every resin pot was treated like a living book. No one picked anything without permission. Before harvesting, incense had to be lit. Before touching the roots, hands had to be cleansed with Nile water. For each plant carried its own spirit, its own breath, and if treated as an object, it would refuse to share its magic. One day, a young woman was brought to the temple, her body gripped by a lingering fever. No wound, no visible pain, only a dazed gaze and shattered sleep. The healer, elderly and calm, did not reach for medicine. He placed his hand on her forehead, then pointed toward the garden. "Choose a scent that makes you feel safe," he said. She slowly walked past rows of flowers and resins, stopping before a bush of coriander, its aroma sharp and warm, and began to cry. The healer did not ask why. He understood that sometimes the body does not hurt where we think it does, and sometimes the first remedy is not what we swallow, but what awakens a memory, a sense of being seen. To the Egyptians, plants were not merely medicine. They were living beings capable of listening, of understanding. Like aloe used to soothe burns, its cool gel calmed not only the skin, but the fear of being wounded for the first time. Like the resin of myrrh, not only an antiseptic, but a scent filled with memories of late afternoons in the temple, when a mother guided her child to offer gifts when pain was named through song. And then there was willow bark, the ancestor of what we now know as aspirin. The Egyptians chewed it for toothaches, stomach pain, or sorrow in the heart, not just for its chemical properties, but because they believed the willow knew how to bend in the wind. It knew endurance. And by taking it into the body, one could learn to endure more gently. Even in their strangest concoctions, crocodile fat, crushed beetle wings, dried snakeskin. We do not see cruelty, but a deep belief that every living thing held a share of life that could be offered. And if combined correctly, under ceremony, under moonlight, with whispered prayers, they could open the door to healing. Many remedies were blended with honey, not only to preserve or soften the bitterness of certain roots, but because the Egyptians believed honey carried order, a gift from bees, creatures that knew how to build, how to live in community, how to keep balance. Every medicine was a poem, written down in the Eber's papyrus and passed by word of mouth from one generation to the next, like a grandmother teaching her grandchild how to brew a healing soup. It was never just about dosage, but about intention. Stir with the wind, they said. Light the fire before the moon climbs too high. Whisper the patient's name when placing the drop upon the tongue. Sounds strange. But if you have ever felt a warm cloth pressed to your forehead by your mother when you had a fever, if your grandmother ever rubbed snake oil into your soles, if someone ever held your hand and said, "Drink this and get some rest," then you already understand. Healing has never been a formula. It is the feeling of being cared for. And in ancient Egypt, that care was expressed through leaves, through blossoms, through whispers in the ear, and through the belief that nature does not only heal. Nature remembers us. Every illness holds a story. And the Egyptians, they did not merely treat the symptoms. They listened to that story. And through listening, they wrote one of the very first chapters of human medicine. When diagnosis is the art of hearing what has not yet been spoken, there are moments when what causes the greatest pain does not appear as a bruise or a groan. It is when a person sits before you, silent, their eyes no longer reflecting sunlight, but something broken, unnamed. And in ancient Egypt, no one rushed to ask, "Where does it hurt?" Instead, they asked, "Why now?" This was the heart of ancient medicine, where diagnosis did not begin with machines, but with empathy, where the healer was not merely someone who cured, but someone who decoded silence. In the middle of the desert, within the cool shadows of an ancient temple, an old woman was brought in on a wooden stretcher. She trembled, her skin clammy with cold sweat, her breathing shallow. And yet, strangely, there were no clear signs. No cuts, no fever, no swelling. Her companions grew panicked, pleading that she had been touched by a curse. The Sunnu, the priest-physician, did not immediately reach for a knife or a vial. He sat before her, hands folded as if listening to the air itself. He watched her breathing, unsteady, quick, as though she were caught in a storm with no wind. He did not ask, "Where does it hurt?" Instead, he gently inquired, "Do you dream?" To the Egyptians, dreams were a doorway into the wounded part of the soul. In dreams, the gods could offer guidance or reveal truths that daylight words could never reach. In a voice like sand carried by wind, the old woman spoke of dreams where she was always falling into a deep pit, her cries unheard. Each day the world around her grew dimmer as though she were dissolving into mist. The Sunnu nodded and called for the dream book, an ancient scroll where symbols were interpreted like maps of the soul. "Falling without end is a sign of lost protection," he said. "Your soul is alone, unguarded. This is not merely an illness. It is a wandering." In Egyptian medicine, diagnosis never stood apart from the context of life. Illness was not seen as a failure of the body, but as an imbalance between the person and the world. Perhaps the gods were displeased. Perhaps resentment had not been released. Perhaps a relationship had been torn. When no explanation could be seen with the eyes, the healers turned to divination, not to predict the future, but to illuminate the unseen. Sometimes they read the patterns made by throwing animal bones into the sand. Sometimes they watched the flight of kites in the sky. Sometimes they simply listened to the wind moving through reeds by the river and asked, "What does the wind say today?" Sound unfamiliar? But if you have ever entered a modern clinic, seen a doctor typing more than looking into your eyes, then you may understand why this mattered. In ancient Egypt, a person was made of blood, wind, light, and emotion. Nothing was outside the scope. For those suffering from mental disturbances, often described as clouded hearing whispers or possessed by another spirit, treatment was not simply medicinal. It was a sacred blend of incense, holy water prayers, and time within the temple. They called it spiritual purification, not exile, not isolation, but calming the storm within through presence. One young man was once brought in because he spoke to someone unseen. He whispered all day to a shadow no one else could see. People were afraid. But the Sunnu did not declare madness. Instead, he gave the young man a place in the temple for a month. Each day he was bathed in herbs, listened to chants, and recorded his dreams on papyrus. One night he dreamed of himself in a paper boat, drifting endlessly, never reaching shore. The next morning the healer simply said, "Then we shall rebuild the sail." In our world today, we have MRI scans, genetic tests, and artificial intelligence analyzing data. But perhaps we have forgotten that diagnosis can also be an act of listening. Listening to dreams, listening to fears, listening even to the words not yet spoken. To the Egyptians, diagnosis was a journey toward restoring balance, and the healer was not a judge, but a companion holding a light for others to pass through the mist. And so we arrive at the final threshold of Egyptian medicine, death. Not to be feared, but to understand why in that civilization, death itself was an act of healing through love. When someone took their last breath on the banks of the Nile, there were no wails piercing the sky. Instead, there was a reverent stillness, as if all things paused to listen as the soul stepped across the threshold between two worlds. No one saw death as failure. In that ancient world, death was not the end. It was a continuation, a journey from this realm to the next. And like any journey, it required preparation, tender, deliberate, and filled with love. For 70 days, the physician, now called the guide of the dead, would care for the body with astonishing precision. First, the body was bathed in Nile water, then anointed with palm wine, not only for purification, but to say goodbye. The internal organs were carefully removed, cleansed, and stored in canopic jars, each one guarded by a protective deity. And the heart, believed to hold memory and virtue, was often left in the chest, or replaced with a scarab amulet symbol of rebirth. Even the brain was drawn out through the nostrils, a gesture that may seem clinical, but was rooted in the belief that the soul did not need reason to pass into the next world, only love and righteousness. The body was then covered in natron salt, lying still for 40 days, as if sleeping between worlds, allowing all heaviness to slowly leave. And when the form was dry and light hands began to wrap it in linen, not a few yards, but hundreds of yards, like pages binding a story that was drawing to a close. Between each layer, amulets were placed: the Eye of Horus, to see the path ahead; the Ankh, for eternal life; the Jed Pillar, to preserve faith; and finally a mask, sometimes of gold, sometimes painted, but always bearing the face they would wear when meeting the ancestors once more. The entire ritual was not meant to cling to life, but to say farewell in the most beautiful way, so the departed would not walk alone, and the living might go on with less regret. Today, we have ventilators, intensive care units, artificial hearts. But even with all this progress, we sometimes feel helpless, small and alone, before life's final frontier. Perhaps this is what the Egyptians understood long ago, that medicine does not always preserve life, but it can preserve dignity. And within every layer of linen, every jar of resin, every whispered spell, thin as smoke, they left behind a message that I believe, in our age, we need more than ever. Healing is not only about extending life. Healing is how we love even in the face of death. When you sit beside someone who is slipping away, when you hold their hand with no words to offer, perhaps the only thing you truly need to bring is your presence, your warmth. That is the prayer. The soft touch to their forehead, that is the ritual. The silence you share, that is the deepest love. If you are remembering someone who has already gone, know that they have not disappeared. They are simply walking through the door, just as the Egyptians believed. And perhaps in the wind you can still hear the whisper they left behind. We have now passed through 6 doors, 6 chapters of an ancient medicine, from prayers in temples to hands that stopped the bleeding, from roots bathed in moonlight to questions as quiet as, "Why now?" And finally, to a farewell performed with all the tenderness one human can offer another. As the story ends, I do not ask you to remember every name or every ritual. I only hope that when someone is in pain, you will listen with your heart. When someone is afraid, you will be there with gentleness. And when someone is ready to go, you will not let them go in silence. They deserve to be seen off with a touch, a soft calling of their name, a goodbye as gentle as the wind. I am still here. If you are still here, by your speaker or your headphones in a quiet room, I want to thank you for joining me on a journey. Few now remember a voyage backward through time to hear the whispers of a world that has long slept beneath the sands for over 3,000 years. The story has ended, but perhaps it still lingers in the silence that follows, like the echo of a song from long ago that never truly fades. For history never sleeps. It whispers, waiting for someone to listen. Have you ever heard of a city not built merely of stone or brick, but of dreams, a place not designed to dominate the world, but to understand it? Over 2,000 years ago, where the Mediterranean Sea kisses the land of Egypt, like an eternal whisper, a city quietly rose from the dust and the light. They called it Alexandria. But do not imagine it as one of those ancient cities buried under layers of time. No, Alexandria was a dream, and that dream began with a man, Alexander the Great. In the year 331, before Christ, after triumphant victories stretching from Greece to Persia, Alexander desired not only an empire forged by the sword, but also one shaped by thought. Standing upon the Egyptian shore, gazing at the silver ocean shimmering in the sunset, he said, "Here I will build a city unlike any other on this earth." But Alexander never lived to see that city take shape, for destiny came early. He died at a very young age, and that dream, like a seed yet to bloom, fell into the hands of another man, General Ptolemy, who would later become Ptolemy the first king of Egypt in the Ptolemaic dynasty. Ptolemy was not merely a warrior. He was a man who cherished the light of knowledge. Under his guidance, Alexandria became not only the new capital of Egypt, but also a place where stars, scrolls, and philosophical conversations mingled together in long, mysterious nights. He and the kings who followed him were not content with building temples or palaces. They sought to create something greater, a temple of knowledge. Not a place to hide secrets, but to throw open the doors to everything humanity had ever known, believed, or imagined. The Library of Alexandria did not begin with walls or pillars, but with a belief that knowledge is not private property, but a flame that can be passed from one person to another, like sharing a candle in the dark. And so emissaries were dispatched. They crossed seas, journeyed through deserts, and visited every known civilization: Athens, Babylon, India, Carthage. They did not carry swords, but a question. Do you have books? Precious scrolls, profound philosophies, rare poetry. We want to copy them all. Can you imagine it? Every merchant ship that docked in Alexandria was searched, not for gold or silver, but for books. Any manuscript found was copied. The original remained in the library, and a replica was returned to the owner. It was an act of both bold pride and extraordinary ambition. It is said that at its peak, the Library of Alexandria may have held up to 400,000 scrolls. But the number mattered less than what they represented. Each scroll was a voice from the past. A Babylonian teacher, an Indian poet, an Egyptian astrologer, all whispering in the reader's ear. And within the stone corridors, among towering columns and flickering oil lamps, the librarians walked in silence. They spoke Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Sanskrit, languages now lost but once echoed in that place, where for the first time in history humans ceased to see themselves as scattered tribes and began to recognize themselves as one species, a species capable of learning together. The library was not just a repository of books. It was a question posed to all of humanity. If we gathered everything mankind had ever known, could we become wiser? And in Alexandria they tried. They did not know when that flame might fade. But in that fleeting moment, in the nights when sea breezes flowed through the library windows, in the gentle debates beneath the shade of grapevines in every inked stroke on papyrus, humanity touched something deeply beautiful. Alexandria did not build just a library. They created a universe where every idea, every philosophy, every record of the cosmos had a place to live, to be debated, to evolve. If the earlier days were when the flame was first lit, then this was when that flame began to spread, when it began to breathe. In a courtyard shaded by olive trees and laurel blossoms beside the library stood the Musion, an ancient Greek word meaning the place of the muses. But do not let the name conjure up quiet galleries. No. The Musion pulsed like a heartbeat. It was a university before that word had ever been spoken. A home where people did not just read books, but lived with them, questioned them, and argued over them late into the night. Even because a single line of Phoenician poetry failed to align with its Greek translation. There, scholars were not guests. They were residents. They were fed, cared for, and encouraged to do the one thing the world outside rarely allowed to think without fear. Can you imagine a day in the Musion? In the morning, an Indian scholar brewed fragrant tea and spread before him a star chart passed down from his ancestors. Beside him, a philosopher from Athens debated the cycle of the soul with an Egyptian physician, one who had just returned from dissecting a human body to discover why the heart disobeyed the mind. And in another corner, under a canopy of ripe grapes, a group of young students excitedly discussed a geometric theorem they had just learned from Euclid. Yes, Euclid, the very man we now call the father of geometry, once walked these very halls. He did not teach with dogma, but through dialogue, the kind that made students not just remember the formulas, but understand why they emerged from an ordered universe. Then there was Eratosthenes, the chief librarian, who once stood beneath the blazing sun holding a wooden stick. He calculated the circumference of the earth not just with mathematics, but with the belief that truth could be found if one only looked closely enough at the shadow on the sand. Here, disciplines were not boxed and labeled. Poetry influenced mathematics. Astronomy inspired medicine. Philosophy led the way for science. Alexandria seemed to understand something the modern world often forgets: knowledge should not be divided. It is a living body, diverse but united by one heartbeat. Of course, not everyone agreed. Some scholars from Judea arrived bearing rare sacred texts, yet kept their distance from Greek reasoning. Others came from Mesopotamia, former slaves now invited to teach cuneiform, still unsure whether to trust in this shared dream. Yet despite tensions, despite differences, they stayed. Because here, something stood above politics or nationality, a deep belief that humans could learn together without having to conquer one another. They were not perfect. There were mistakes, biases, even jealousy. But imagine this in a world where most places only believed in the power of weapons. Alexandria chose to place its faith in pens and paper and curiosity. They did not know they were living in a golden age. No one ever does. But you know what? In those moments, the soft rustle of papyrus, the sound of ink dripping onto a manuscript, the gentle laughter during a debate about the human brain, that was the sound of humanity becoming a species that could learn. Alexandria did not just store books. It held hope that if we are patient enough, open enough, and eager enough, then everything humanity has ever dreamed, from the first poem to the formula for healing, can be preserved. And more than preserved, it can be continued. In the year 48, before Christ, Alexandria stood at the threshold between eras. The city still gleamed, but its white stone walls now reflected not only sunlight, but also the faint shadows of political unrest. A man arrived from the west, Julius Caesar, bearing fame, power, and a heart torn between love and duty. He did not come to Alexandria to burn books. He came to extinguish a fire, the fire of a civil war between two siblings, Cleopatra and her younger brother, who was also her husband, Ptolemy XIII, known to history by his somber moniker, Tommy Thurish-themed. Caesar did not understand Alexandria the way those who had lived and breathed it did. To him, it was a chessboard of power. But what he did not realize was that beneath every cobblestone his horse trod, beneath every dock he glimpsed from his ship, lay centuries of slumbering wisdom, as fragile as ash. When fighting broke out near the port, Caesar found himself besieged. In a strategic military move, one that failed to account for cultural consequences, he ordered the fleet's storage to be set ablaze to prevent enemy forces from approaching by sea. It was one decision among hundreds he had made in battle. But within the heart of Alexandria, the fire did not stop at wood and rope. Winds from the sea fanned the flames onto the roofs of nearby warehouses, buildings that held precious copies from the library. Fragile papyrus scrolls burned like straw. Works on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy turned to ash without a cry. We may never know for certain, was it the main building of the library or just an annex historians debate. But for those who love books, that hardly matters. Whether it was 40,000 or 400,000 scrolls, the loss of even a single poem meant the world dimmed just a little. And that light slowly faded. Not with a roar, not all at once, but like a banquet that went on too long, guests leaving one by one, candles snuffing out until only an empty room remained. After the fire, Alexandria lived on, but part of its soul had vanished in the smoke. The kings who followed no longer shared the same passion for knowledge. Politics took the throne. Trust was replaced with control. Scholars departed. The Motion no longer buzzed with voices. The gardens of debate grew quiet, as if the city was learning how to forget. The library did not die in a single night. It died slowly in forgetting. And yet, strangely, the dream did not completely vanish. From the ashes of memory, Alexandria built a new place, the Serapeum, a sacred temple to the god Serapis perched on a hill overlooking the city. There a second library was formed, not as grand, not as vast, but still there was hope. No longer did they dream of gathering all human knowledge into one place. That dream had burned too fiercely. But in the Serapeum, scholars continued to read, to write, to teach, as if that act alone was a form of resistance. Can you see that image? An old scholar, his hair silver, climbing each morning the worn stone steps of the Serapis temple. In his hand, a yellowed scroll containing just a passage on the heartbeat's rhythm written long ago by Herophilos. But to him, It was a treasure, a vital fragment of memory, a heartbeat of Alexandria. And you, have you ever wondered, if one day the library you love disappeared, what would you do? Would you forget? Or would you cling to every worn page like a vow? That is what the people of the Serapeum did. They did not fight with swords. They fought with memory. Imagine a spring afternoon in Alexandria, sometime in the early 4th century. Atop the hill, the Serapeum still stood tall, towering white columns gleaming under the sun, surrounded by the cries of seagulls and the fragrant incense of ritual. Inside, beneath the cool domes, the last remaining scholars still gathered. They sat side by side with ancient manuscripts, continuing to read, to write, to teach, as if the outside world no longer existed. But the outside world had changed. The Roman Empire, once sprawling across the Mediterranean, was shifting. From a realm that tolerated many gods, it now sought a single truth, and that truth bore the name of Christianity. At first it arrived like a fresh wind, full of hope, compassion, and the promise of salvation. But as with any belief system given absolute power, it began to twist. No longer a refuge for the weak, it became a tool to purge what was different. In the year 391, after Christ, Emperor Theodosius I issued an edict banning all forms of pagan worship. Ancient temples, once guardians of knowledge, were now condemned as symbols of heresy, and the Serapeum, standing highest above the city, became the first target. Can you picture that moment? Soldiers bearing crosses on their chests entered the temple, not as pilgrims, but as conquerors. They smashed statues of the gods, toppled altars, tore apart scrolls that did not align with the truth. A fury unleashed in the name of God. No one knows exactly how many scrolls were still held in the Serapeum. Perhaps they had already been hidden. Perhaps some were lost long before. But what is certain is this: the last flame of hope had finally been extinguished. For the scholars who remained, it was not that event that destroyed them, but the silence that followed. Suddenly, there were no places left to teach. No students, no patrons. Only a quiet, aching certainty that the world no longer had room for questions unconfirmed by Scripture. I want to leave you with one final image of that place, perhaps not found in any history book, but one I believe once existed. An old scholar, his hair the color of ash, returns to the Serapeum after its destruction. He does not come to reclaim anything. He simply stands at the familiar steps, his hand tracing a crack in the stone pillar where he once sat and read. The wind stirs the dust. The scent of sun-baked stone lingers. And in that moment, he does not cry. He only whispers, "If only they understood." We were never against God. We only wished to understand him in more languages. Alexandria continued afterward as a city under one empire, then another. But its soul, the one that once blazed like a beacon through the long night of humankind, had vanished into smoke. You know, the true pain of this story is not in the destruction itself. It lies in the choice between the light of diversity and the certainty of black and white. And in that choice, Alexandria lost. Not because wisdom was not strong enough, but because sometimes humanity fears complexity more than it fears war. Many years after the destruction of the Serapeum, Alexandria was no longer the lighthouse of the world's intellect. but amidst the ruins of ancient academies, among the streets now echoing with hymns rather than philosophical debate, there remained a spark that refused to die. Her name was Hypatia. Imagine an autumn morning in Alexandria around the year 400 after Christ. Bright crimson bougainvillea cascades down tiled rooftops. The early air is still fresh with sea breeze. In the central square, echoing through the stone-paved streets, footsteps ring out, steady, unhurried, unafraid. It is her. Hypatia was unlike any woman of her time. While other women were confined to the walls of their homes, bound to the roles of wife, mother, believer, she stood upon a lectern. She taught philosophy. She drew celestial charts. She solved geometric equations for young men who had traveled from across the Mediterranean, from Judea, Rome, Greece, Egypt. They did not come for her appearance. They came for the light within her mind. The daughter of Theon, a renowned mathematician and astronomer, Hypatia grew up among diagrams and manuscripts. But she did not merely inherit her father's teachings. She went beyond. Her mind was sharp, her speech captivating. When she explained an astronomical phenomenon, one did not simply understand. One felt as though a veil had been lifted from the edge of the cosmos. But as you know, intellect, especially when paired with independence, is always a threat to those in power. At that time, Alexandria was a pressure cooker. Christianity had become the state religion. Clergy were increasingly entwined in politics. Tensions flared between religious factions, between the faithful and the so-called pagans, between church authority and civic rule. Cyril, the ambitious bishop, saw Hypatia's presence as a thorn. She did not oppose him, but she did not submit. She declared no creed, renounced no science. She stood in between, a bridge between past and present, between polytheism and monotheism, between reason and faith. And like all bridges stretched across divided shores, she was broken. In the year 415, after Christ, on a March day, as she traveled home in her personal chariot, a frenzied mob blocked her path. They were not soldiers. They were believers. People who thought that by killing Hypatia, they were doing right in the eyes of God. What happened next does not need to be recounted in detail. It is enough to know they did not just kill a woman. They tried to kill an idea. But do you know what is more terrifying than death? The silence that followed. No one dared speak. No one dared defend her. The entire city turned away as if she had never existed. One devoted student once wrote, "She surpassed the boundaries of womanhood, and for that, the world did not know how to forgive her." And yet, history remembers longer than politics. Her name, Hypatia, survived the flames, the silence, the centuries of forgetting. Not because she was defiant, not because she was a towering figure, but because she was human, a living answer to a question that never grows old. How many more times will we allow wisdom to be murdered? There are stories that never die, not because they are rewritten, but because they are still unfolding. And Alexandria never truly disappeared. More than 2,000 years ago, humanity first believed that knowledge could be a shared language, that a Babylonian priest, an Indian mathematician, an Egyptian poet, and a Greek philosopher could sit together, not to let debate become war, but to listen to each other, and to the universe. Alexandria was not built from stone, but from a profound question. What would happen if we gathered all human wisdom in one place? Sadly, the answer was burned, not just by fire, but by fanaticism, by power, by fear of difference. But there is one thing the destroyers did not know. Knowledge does not live in paper. It lives in memory, in stories, in the hearts that still dare to wonder. Have you ever wondered if Alexandria had not fallen? How different would our world be today? Perhaps we would have had computers by the 10th century. Perhaps we would have understood DNA in the Middle Ages. Perhaps humanity would have set foot on Mars during the Renaissance. Or perhaps we would have simply learned to live together more peacefully, because when you are used to viewing the universe through many mental maps, you become less certain that you are always right. But the most heartbreaking thing is not what we never had. It is what once existed, then vanished before anyone could write it down. Plays that were never performed again. Buildings never completed. Theories about light, about life, about dreams, all once inscribed on papyrus, now blown away like ash. Alexandria was not just a library burned. It was a moment when humanity almost touched a better version of itself, then lost it. But tonight, you are listening. You are remembering. And that alone brings Alexandria back to life, right here in this quiet room. Because every time you ask, why is that so, you are mending the broken thread. Every time you open a book not on any must-read list, or listen to a perspective different from your own without shutting down, you are picking up a fragment from the ancient stone floor. Every time you choose to teach your child how to think instead of simply what to believe, you are writing new lines into those lost scrolls. We live in an age where knowledge is everywhere, just one touch of a screen away. But it is also a time when lies, prejudice, and noise have never spread more easily. And that is why the story of Alexandria still matters, because it reminds us that truth must be cared for. Knowledge does not protect itself, and light, no matter how bright, needs someone to keep it burning. Do you see? The Library of Alexandria does not lie in some distant ruin. It lives in the way you are reading these words, in the way you choose to listen to history without turning away, in the very question rising within you now, if they once made such a mistake, are we repeating it? And perhaps what truly matters is not how many scrolls we restore, but what we learn from what was lost. Now the night is nearly over, but sit still a little longer. Close your eyes. Imagine a long corridor filled with golden light with thousands of scrolls lined side by side. In that silence, perhaps you will hear the gentle footsteps of Hypatia, of Eratosthenes, of a young student who once dreamed of writing his name into the sky with mathematics. And perhaps you too are walking down that corridor, because the light of Alexandria in truth was never extinguished. Good night, and never stop asking questions. Have you ever wondered how the greatest individuals in history began their lives? Not in golden castles or amidst resounding applause, but in silence, in the biting cold, shrouded in the darkness of poverty and despair. If you are still awake tonight, let us journey back through time to a place almost forgotten by the world, a humble log cabin on the outskirts of Hodgenville, Kentucky, and a child born upon the cold earth gently stirring before a destiny of greatness. The year was 1809. A brutal winter gripped the American frontier. The wind howled through the cracks of the wooden boards like the groans of the ancient forest. There was no light, no lullabies, only the faint sobs of a mother, the scent of smoke soaked into rotting wood, and a baby boy, Abraham, crying out for the first time amidst darkness and frost. The cabin had only one room with rough-hewn walls and a damp earthen floor. Not even a single candle lit the first night of his life. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a strong man who lived by his axe and his hands, a carpenter and woodcutter who placed no faith in lofty words, only in the soil and his own labor. His mother, Nancy Hanks, was his opposite. She possessed a voice as gentle as the spring breeze, eyes full of quiet depth, and an unshakable belief in God. Young Abraham inherited both of them, a body built for endurance and a soul drawn to thought. The Lincoln family moved constantly, wandering from Kentucky to Indiana, chasing the faint promises of new land. With each new home came the same routine: clearing trees, burning stumps, feeding ashes into the poor soil in hopes of coaxing a harvest of corn. They survived on what they could hunt, gather, or trade. There was never plenty, and winter was merciless. At night, the howls of wolves echoed from the woods. By day, even the small hands of a child had to carry water, patch the roof, and raise fences from timber as hard as stone. Then one day, when Abraham was only 9, something in that small world broke. His mother fell ill. No one knew why. She had been healthy the day before, but by the next she lay still, her eyes glazed over, her body growing colder. Much later, people would name the illness milk sickness, a silent death that crept in through cow's milk tainted by a poisonous plant. Nancy died with cruel swiftness. There was no preacher, no coffin. Only a mound of earth beneath a tree, a stone to mark it, and a boy standing in silence, unable to cry. From that moment on, Lincoln was no longer an ordinary child. His sorrow did not show on his face, but lived deep within his eyes. It was a sorrow without voice, like the darkness that always lingers behind you no matter how brightly the sun may shine. And yet, as if by some miracle, light finds its way back. A year later, his father brought home a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She brought no riches, but she did bring something the Lincolns had never known: books, and a warm heart strong enough to mend the quiet wounds of a grieving boy. Sarah did not treat Abraham like the other children. She saw something in him, deeper, stranger, and she did not try to stop it from blooming. Instead of the axe, Abraham chose the book. Not out of idleness, the work was endless, but because he hungered to understand a world beyond forests and cornfields. With no schools, no teachers, the boy read anything he could find: the Bible, Aesop's fables, epics, and travelogues. Some days he would walk nearly 6 miles, or about 10 kilometers, just to borrow a book, and then stay up all night reading by the faint glow of burning embers. When you listen to the sounds of the night, the wind, the insects, the beating of your heart, imagine that lonely place where a boy is reading, his eyes fixed on the page, unmoved by the cold seeping through his threadbare coat. This was not mere learning. It was faith, that in those written words lay a way out of poverty, a path away from destiny, and perhaps one day the power to change the United States of America. Some are born into peace and comfort. Others, like Lincoln, are born of dirt and hunger, yet carry within them a quiet flame. A flame that does not blaze immediately, but smolders, like fire in the night, small and steady, but never extinguished. Some souls are born in the wilderness, not to stir the world with noise, but to quietly transform it from within. Abraham Lincoln was one such soul. As he entered his teenage years, tall and lanky, with long arms and narrow shoulders, he looked like a sapling that had yet to harden standing alone in a field of snow. He spoke little and often stared off into the distance. On the harsh American frontier, people were not accustomed to children who daydreamed. But Abraham was different. He did not fight with fists, but with imagination. Neighbors called him strange, not because he was weak. In fact, he could wrestle down nearly anyone in the area, but because after the farm work was done, instead of drinking or tending to his rifle, he would sit alone under a tree reading poetry or carving notes into bark with a dull knife. Once someone caught him reciting a long passage from Shakespeare while building a fence. His world was not limited to forests and soil. In Abraham's mind, there were oceans and mountains, distant cities, ancient heroes, and questions that those around him never asked. What does justice mean? Is freedom meant for all people? And can life be different if we simply learn to listen to one another? Thomas, his father, could not understand. He was a man of labor, not of thought. To him, a good day was one in which wood was chopped, a pen was raised, and no one complained. He cared for his son, but did not know how to love a child who lived more in his mind than in the world. In his eyes, Abraham's habit of clinging to books was not a sign of brilliance, but of weakness. Yet Abraham never rebelled against his father. He still chopped wood, still hauled water, still climbed the roof to help patch it when the wind howled. Only his soul was always somewhere else. And the world he built in silence grew day by day, like a secret city only he could enter. By the time Abraham reached his 20s, his body had grown to an awkward height, 6 feet 4 inches tall, or about 1 meter and 93 centimeters. He often wore pants that were too short, or sleeves that hung too long. His face was long and gaunt, his eyes always seeming to observe something no one else could see. He looked like a wooden figure carved from the ancient forest, shaped by wind, by time, by poverty, and by questions still unanswered. In 1831 he left home and arrived in a place called New Salem, a small riverside town in Illinois where the breeze carried the musty scent of shipping crates and the sweat of laborers. He arrived with no money, no plan, and no one waiting for him. Only one thing, a belief that if he lived honestly, people would notice. And they did. At first he worked in a small store, selling salt soap cloth, but what people remembered was not the goods, but the man himself. Once an elderly woman overpaid him by a few cents, and Lincoln walked several miles, or about 5 kilometers, just to return the change. Another time he damaged the spine of a borrowed book and spent the entire following week repairing and rebinding it before returning it. People began to call him Honest Abe, a simple name, yet in an era when most kept a knife hidden in their belt, it was as precious as gold. But that was not all. Whenever it rained and customers were few and the store grew quiet, Abraham would tell stories, long winding tales that seemed pointless until the ending made people laugh or stop to think. Once, while the shopkeeper was away, customers came not to buy anything, but simply to hear that tall fellow spin a yarn. In a world weighed down by worry, his stories were like a paper fan in the summer heat. They solved nothing, yet somehow made people want to keep going. It was in this setting that Lincoln first stepped into politics. In 1832, he ran for a seat in the state legislature, and he lost. But strangely, he did not disappear like so many other defeated men. He stayed, kept working, kept telling stories, kept helping others. And by 1834, he was elected. Between those two campaigns, he joined the Black Hawk War, not as a soldier in battle, but as a captain elected by his peers. He never fired a shot, never shed blood, but earned trust, because people believed he would not use power to do something dishonorable. New Salem did not keep Lincoln for long, but it nourished him with trust, with simplicity, and with a dream that was beginning to take shape. From a young man reading by candlelight, he became someone others began to listen to. And then, one day, Lincoln made a decision to become a lawyer. No academy, no professors, no formal schooling. He borrowed books, read through the night, took notes on the blank sides of butter wrappers, and studied line by line. Just as he had once learned life itself, with patience, with calloused hands, and with a heart that never stopped searching. And so a lawyer was born from dirt sweat and the flickering light of hope. If you have ever stepped inside a law office, you likely know the scent of old paper, the sound of flipping case files, and the distant feeling that walls built from legal language often create. But for Abraham Lincoln, the law did not begin in such a place. It began in a small room lit by a flickering oil lamp filled with borrowed books and a question that echoed within him each night. Can justice be touched? Or is it only a beautiful idea that the weak must believe in while the strong bend it to their will? In 1836, after many sleepless nights spent reading legal texts by the firelight, Abraham Lincoln was officially licensed to practice law in the state of Illinois. He moved to Springfield, a city growing much like himself, where the bustle of shops, the clatter of hooves, and the heartbeat of a young democracy pulsed with increasing clarity. Here Lincoln did more than practice law. He gradually became part of the very soul of the city. His work was not glamorous. He took on every kind of case, from land disputes and debt settlements to charges of murder. He was not a hero slamming down the gavel of justice, but a man who listened. And in his words, people heard more compassion than condemnation. He spoke the language of the people, not the cold Latin of legal tradition or lofty argument. More importantly, he never humiliated his opponents, even in victory. That was rare in an era where words were often the sharpest blade used to crush the defeated. But Lincoln did not seek triumph for glory. He only wanted to see the truth stand up, trembling if it must, in a room full of prejudice. During his early years as a lawyer, Lincoln met Mary Todd, a woman of Kentucky's upper-class, educated, sharp-witted, and so outspoken that many found her intimidating. But not Lincoln. The two were like light and shadow, fire and water. Mary saw in Lincoln what few others did, a quiet, powerful force, a man who lived more by conviction than convenience. They fell in love, then parted, then returned to each other. Friends said Lincoln never believed he deserved her. He even confessed in a letter that he doubted whether a man like myself could ever make her happy. The hesitation did not stem from a lack of love, but from a deep fear he had carried since childhood that a child born on muddy ground had no right to dream of reaching for the refined. Even so, they married on November 4th, 1842. Their marriage was far from tranquil. Mary was brilliant but unstable, passionate but easily wounded, and Lincoln, though steady, always carried with him a sorrow too deep for words. They loved each other like survivors imperfectly, but earnestly. And from that love came 4 children, only one of whom lived to adulthood. The death of Edward at just 4 years old and later Willie, Lincoln's closest son, who died of typhoid fever in the White House. These losses carved wounds into his heart, not with screams, but with silence. The kind of silence that makes breathing heavier. Amid courtroom victories, Lincoln still lived with a hollowness no one could quite understand. Friends said he often sat alone for hours, eyes fixed on nothing. He was not simply sad. He carried sorrow like part of his body, like his breath, like the slight forward bend of his gait. And it was within that quiet that he began to see something larger. The law was not enough. It could resolve disputes, but not systematic injustice. It could protect property rights, but not human dignity. Not when some people were born to be counted as another's property. America at that time was fracturing. It called itself the land of the free, yet millions were still chained by shackles and by law. Lincoln saw it. He was not yet a pioneer. He did not shout slogans, but inside him the struggle had already begun, quiet but irreversible. In 1854, when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing new territories to decide for themselves whether to permit slavery, Lincoln understood this was not just policy. This was a crack in the soul of the nation. And he began to speak out. Slowly, speech by speech, debate by debate. Not with anger, not with judgment, but with arguments drawn from the very principles upon which the country was founded, that all men are created equal, and that freedom cannot be the property of the powerful. By 1858, Lincoln entered one of the most important ideological battles of his life, 7 debates with Senator Stephen A. Douglas, the political titan of the era. Lincoln, awkward, wrinkled in clothes with a deep voice, stood face to face with a master orator sharp and commanding. But Lincoln did not need to win with appearances. He did not need to shout, did not need to slam his hand on the podium. He asked a simple question. Can a nation endure permanently half slave and half free? He lost the Senate race, but the words he spoke traveled farther than ballots. People began to speak his name in places he had never been. They called him a man of conscience in every phrase, one who spoke of liberty as though it were breath itself. And then, in an America torn apart by its own contradictions, Abraham Lincoln began to emerge as the hope for the most ordinary and extraordinary thing that human beings long for to be fully human. There are nights in history when the skies hold no storm, yet the human heart surges like a sea in turmoil. A nation stretched taut like a violin string, where even the slightest touch might not produce music, but war. In November of 1860, on a night cold enough to bite through the skin, the final votes were counted. Abraham Lincoln, the tall, slender man who had once stepped out from the shadows of poverty and silence, had become the 16th President of the United States. He was not an easy choice. To many, he was still just a Midwestern lawyer with a somber voice, rumpled clothes, and a bearing foreign to the Eastern elite. Yet he was chosen, not by shouts, but by a quiet faith in principles. And just weeks later, something terrifying happened. The southern states, beginning with South Carolina, declared secession. They did not wait for his inauguration. They did not want to see him in the White House. To them, Lincoln was more than a president. He was a warning, a signal of the end of a system that had sustained them for generations, slavery. Before Lincoln ever stepped into the Oval Office, the Union had already begun to fracture. By the time he raised his hand to take the oath in March of 1861, 7 states had seceded. The American flag fluttered above the Capitol, trembling before a storm ready to break. And then, as if fate had lost its patience in April of that year, Fort Sumter was fired upon. The sound of cannon fire was not merely smoke and thunder, it was the birth cry of civil war. Abraham Lincoln had never studied military tactics. He had never seen battle. He had never imagined himself making life and death decisions for hundreds of thousands. But now the weight of an entire nation rested on his shoulders like a living statue standing amid howling winds and flying bullets. He studied strategy books by night. By day he listened to generals, then weighed, then doubted, then decided, often alone. As blood was shed on the battlefield, he braced himself against invisible arrows from every side, a critical press, political rivals accusing him of tyranny, even his own cabinet questioning his choices. He replaced generals not in search of a military genius, but of someone who could truly understand the urgency of justice. And in those same nights, he also mourned. In 1862, his young son Willie, the gentlest remaining light in Lincoln's heart, died of typhoid fever in the White House. No trumpets, no gun salutes, just a piercing silence. That father, the President of the United States, sat quietly beside an empty bed, then wandered alone to visit his son's grave at night, a long shadow passing through the National Gardens. For Lincoln, it was more than grief. It was complete empathy with the pain of every other father, on both sides of the war. He understood with every bullet he allowed to be fired, there could be another Willie who would never come home. But it was in these darkest days that Lincoln made the brightest decision of his life. On January 1st, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not break every chain at once, but it redirected the very soul of the war. Now the fight was no longer just to preserve the Union. It was to redefine what America meant. He once said, "If slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong." And through that proclamation, he placed his moral heart at the very center of the conflict. There was no turning back. From that moment on, every battle became a question of conscience. Every death, a vow never to return to injustice. He was not only trying to win a war, he was trying to defeat the darker parts of his nation's history. Later that same year, Lincoln traveled to a place called Gettysburg, the bloodiest battlefield of the Civil War, where over 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing in just a few days. He was not the main speaker. The keynote orator spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln then rose, pulled a folded paper from his coat, and read just 272 words. No thunderous applause, no standing ovation. But that speech, the Gettysburg Address, became the second declaration of American purpose. He said that this war was to prove that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. No threats, no boasting, just a clarity full of quiet strength, like a lantern in a winter night. Not dazzling, but enough to guide the way. With every heavy breath of that era, Lincoln quietly bore the weight of the nation's final hope. He was not a revolutionary. He was not a prophet. He was a father who had lost a child, a man who once read books by candlelight, a person brave enough to believe that kindness was not weakness. And in America's darkest night, he did not start a fire. He became its keeper. War does not end with the sound of gunfire. It ends in exhaustion. of land of mothers who have lost their sons, and of souls that have traveled too far from innocence. For 4 years, the United States was torn in two by hatred, and when the final smoke began to lift, what remained was not victory, but a nation that had to learn how to stand again without trembling. In early 1865, Abraham Lincoln walked slowly through the halls of the White House, his face marked not just by age, but by every decision he had carried on his shoulders. The once black hair had turned nearly white, and his eyes had deepened into shadow, not the shadow of failure, but of a man who had seen too much truth to ever look away again. Every day he read casualty lists. Every night he wrote for the future, for people he would never meet. Someone once asked him, "Do you not grow weary, Mr. President?" He only smiled softly and said, "I do not have the time to be tired." On March 4th, 1865, during the inauguration for his second term, Lincoln stepped before the public in a gentle rain. Drops of water fell from the brim of his hat, like tears from a worn-out god. But in that speech, brief, solemn, and beautiful, he did not speak of victory. He did not blame the defeated. He did not glorify the winners. Instead, he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds." Those words were not a policy. They were a plea, the final whisper of a man trying to save the soul of a nation that had wounded itself. He understood that victory without compassion was merely another silent failure, and he did not want America merely to survive. He wanted it to be worthy of survival. Only 5 weeks after that speech on April 9th, 1865, Southern General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. The Civil War was over. People rejoiced. Church bells rang. Crowds flooded the streets. But Lincoln did not celebrate. He sat quietly, eyes distant, as if listening for the voices of those who would never return. To him, peace was not the silence after cannon fire. It was the responsibility that began after the final crack. He began planning a South without vengeance, a Union built on forgiveness, and a future in which African Americans would be not only free, but welcomed as full human beings. These ideas, at that time, were both bold and dangerous. He was not naive. He knew he was walking the line between light and a bullet. But as he had always done in life, Lincoln chose the harder path, if it was the right one. On the evening of April 14th, just 5 days after the war had ended, Abraham Lincoln went to Ford's Theater with his wife to see the play, Our American Cousin. They say he laughed. For the first time in months, his smile had breath in it. No one in the audience knew that moment would become eternal. John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and an extremist Southern sympathizer, slipped quietly behind him, raised a pistol, and pulled the trigger. That shot did not just kill a president. It brought the nation to a halt. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died the next morning, April 15th, 1865, with Mary at his side, and America facing a loss no words could replace. News of his death spread like thunder without lightning. The North mourned in silence, not with banners, but with streets absent of laughter, children clutching their mothers' hands and hats held solemnly over hearts as the funeral train began its journey. His flag-draped casket traveled from Washington, D.C., back to Springfield, where it had all begun, through a sea of people lining the tracks as if the entire country were holding its breath in farewell. At Oak Ridge Cemetery, he was laid to rest among the trees and spring winds. A monument was raised above his grave. Later, his face would be carved into a mountain and printed on currency. But what made Lincoln immortal was never in the stone. It lived in what every American, every free human being, still feels when they think of him, that sometimes kindness is the greatest revolution of all. He did not live to see America rebuilt. He did not see the civil rights movement a century later. But the seed he planted did not die. It grew in words, in laws, and in every heart that still believes that compassion and justice are the most sacred things worth holding on to. And if you are still listening tonight in the hush of evening air somewhere, you might still hear him whisper, "We do not need to be perfect. We only need to keep trying, to be right." Some people enter history with the sound of thunder, and then there are those, like Abraham Lincoln, who enter with silence. Not a silence of weakness, but the silence of a slowly burning candle, bright enough to guide the way, quiet enough not to set anything ablaze. When he died, America did not merely lose a president. It lost a moral compass, a force that guided the nation not through power, but through character. News of his death did not spread like wildfire. It moved like a quiet crack through the heart of the American people. Crowds stood along the railroad tracks, not waving flags, not shouting slogans, but simply placing hands over their hearts as the funeral train passed by, as if someone dear had gone and they had not yet found the words to say thank you. The modern world often imagines greatness as something loud, a dazzling stage and undeniable presence. But if you follow Lincoln's life, from the boy reading by the fireside to the grieving father in the White House, to the leader who chose kindness in the midst of war, you will understand that greatness is sometimes the ability to hear what is right amid the noise of the times. He was not perfect. He doubted himself. He carried sorrow more than he spoke of it. But it was this very conflict that made him real, and because of it, he became a quiet companion to every generation that followed. Perhaps you are living in a different age, where wars are fought in anonymous arguments online, where value is measured in likes or in the volume of one's voice. Still, Lincoln remains. Not in monuments, but in the quiet choices you make each day to forgive rather than retaliate, to listen instead of shout, to take a step forward rather than remain frozen in fear. This story does not end with his death. It ends in us, the living, and in how we choose to keep that flame alive. You do not need to be a president to change the world. Sometimes all it takes is to be the one who keeps a little light when all around is dark. Lincoln once wrote, "I am a slow walker, but I never walk back." Perhaps that is all we ever needed to learn from him. Tonight, as you turn off the light, maybe you can hold a moment of silence, not to mourn, but to listen. Perhaps, just perhaps, in that quiet, you will hear the creak of old wood from a Kentucky cabin, the soft rustle of a page beneath candlelight, or the gentle breath of a soul that once led a nation through its storm. And if anything remains after all of this, let it be this: true greatness never shouts. It whispers, like the night, like Lincoln. A very faint sound, like the whisper of stalks slipping across a gleaming wooden floor. A gentle tap, then another, then hundreds more. And suddenly, the entire trading floor began to tremble like a fever. There were no bombs, no sirens, no trenches. Only crimson numbers glowing on the boards and eyes frozen in disbelief. It was a morning in October of 1929, and within just a few days, America would plunge into a nightmare no one had ever dared imagine. Tonight, the door of time swings open, returning us to the moment when a national dream began to unravel. A dream once called the Roaring Twenties. You are standing on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. The autumn breeze weaves coolly between the newly risen skyscrapers. A Ford Model A rumbles proudly by its engine roaring with confidence. Behind crystal-clear windows, flapper dresses shimmer under the lights, and jazz music drifts out from every window frame. Americans believed then that they were living in an age of endless prosperity. Wall Street was like a cathedral of wealth. Investors in silk ties and polished leather shoes stepped onto the trading floor as if entering a theater. There, every bell was an opportunity. Every phone call a promise of fortune. Everyone wanted a slice of the great pie, from powerful tycoons to middle-class families in Ohio to school teachers in Kansas. People poured money into the stock market. Some even borrowed to buy stocks because everyone believed the price can only go up. But beneath that shiny metallic glow were hidden cracks. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. Social safety nets were nearly non-existent. People were building castles on sand, only this sand had been gilded. And then, on a seemingly ordinary morning in October, a few stocks began to slip. No one worried. No one could imagine that within just days, the entire market would collapse. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Screams echoed. Papers fluttered like falling leaves. Telephones rang endlessly, but no one picked up. Stock prices plummeted to unthinkable lows, and no one was buying. Those who had been millionaires just moments before were suddenly penniless. Some collapsed to their knees on the floor, heads buried in trembling hands. Others quietly stepped out onto high balconies. But the stock market was only the first place swallowed by the storm. The shock wave spread as fast as fire through dry straw. Banks began to shut down. No one insured the deposits. People rushed to withdraw their savings, only to find locked doors and empty vaults. Trust, that invisible yet most essential thing, evaporated overnight. In Detroit, the machinery at the automobile factories fell silent. In Kansas, farmers could not sell their harvested wheat. In Ohio, teachers quit their classrooms to search for work with their hands. The father in a suit, once the pride of the family, now stood in line for a bowl of soup from a church kitchen. Children went to sleep with empty stomachs, while mothers quietly skipped meals to save food for their little ones. They began selling everything: wedding rings, wooden cabinets, even their only pair of shoes. Some traded an ancestral pocket watch for a few cans of meat. Cities were filled with silent figures, heads bowed low. It was not just an economic collapse. It was the fracture of the American dream. And yet, even in those darkest days, there were strange moments of grace. An old man sharing his last loaf of bread with a neighbor. A child drawing pictures on the wall of the cars his father used to repair. A wife carefully stitching an old coat for her husband's job hunt, as if each needle stroke were a prayer. No one knew what tomorrow would bring. Only one quiet question glimmered in everyone's eyes. How long will this nightmare last? And somewhere in a modest room in New York, a man sat silently by his radio, penning the first lines of a speech that would echo through history. the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But that is the tale of another night. Tonight, collapse does not always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with the rustle of paper stocks and the quiet shattering of trust. And when the light retreats, it is then that people must learn again how to strike the spark. Stocks falling to the trading floor. By now, those papers have long turned to ash, scattered into the freezing winds of the winter of 1930. Outside Wall Street, the golden mask of the roaring decade has fallen away, and when the neon lights went out, people finally saw the cracks in the walls, the emptiness in their stomachs, and the hollowness in their hearts. In Chicago, a man who had once worked as an accountant for a steel company now stood hunched in a bread line. His coat, worn and fraying, had been stitched back together with thread borrowed from his wife. His small child stood beside him, gripping the hem of his coat, not crying because hunger had long since become familiar. No one spoke. Only the soft sound of shoes against dirty snow and the sharp frozen breath breaking in the air. The crisis did not just steal jobs. It took pride. People who had built homes with their own hands, started businesses, sent their children to college, now exchanged the last things they owned for a few coins. An old wedding ring, a piano no one played anymore, a pair of children's shoes that no longer had feet to fill them. "I used to be someone useful," one man whispered in his journal. "Now I am just a shadow in a line." The city was no longer a place of opportunity. It became a shelter for dreams trapped behind cold brick walls. People gave the slums a bitter name. Hooverville's a grim nod to the president who still believed the market would heal itself. But in the American Midwest, once golden with grain, the crisis wore another face dust. Imagine living in Oklahoma in 1932. One morning you open the window and see nothing. Just a thick wall of black dust rolling toward you like a living monster. The wind howls, chickens suffocate in their coops. Crops wither the moment they sprout. Dust seeps through every crack into beds, into food, into the fragile lungs of children. Dust Bowl, they called it, as if naming a vengeful spirit striking back for the years humans had plowed the prairies and stripped away the native grasses in pursuit of profit. Farmers fought against the invisible skies without rain winds, without mercy. They patched roofs, sprinkled water on the ground to keep from breathing in the dust. But eventually they had nothing left to sell, nothing left to eat, and nothing left to believe in. They loaded everything onto rickety trucks, tying down their belongings with rope and hope, and headed west to California, the promised land. It did not matter whether they came from Texas, Arkansas, or Missouri. They were all called by one name, Okies. Down the scorching highways rolled convoys of dust-covered vehicles. Dust clung to their hair, weariness etched deep into their eyes. They rested beneath shade trees, dipping dry bread in well water. At night, they unrolled blankets on roadsides. Children huddled together. The adults lay in silence. Some families crossed the entire country just to pick peaches for 3 cents an hour and sleep again in the fields. And then some began to document it. Dorothea Lange, with her old camera, captured moments no one thought would survive. Mothers with faces lined by time. Children clinging to their mothers' skirts as if clinging to the idea of home. The photographed migrant mother was not just a picture. It was sorrow. It was quiet dignity. It was the unspoken question. Are we still human? Writer John Steinbeck stepped into the migrant camps and wrote The Grapes of Wrath. Not just a novel, but a record of a nation asking itself, why must the good suffer so deeply? And so, amid the dust storms and breadlines, something strange appeared: solidarity. People began to share. A can of baked beans passed to a neighbor. An old blanket offered to an elderly couple living beside the train tracks. A joke told just to remind everyone that even with nothing, we were still people. Because when the American dream collapsed, people did not simply wake up. They kept walking. Beneath the layers of dust and poverty, there was a resilience no storm could carry away. Tonight, if you have ever felt lost in a chaotic age, buried under unpaid bills or dreams yet to come true, remember this. There was once a generation forced to choose between staying and moving on, between shame and survival, and they walked forward step by step through the dust. Because sometimes history does not roar with gunfire. It whispers through bare feet on cracked soil, through a mother's eyes watching her hungry child, and through the voice of an old radio crackling in the night. There will be hope, as long as we do not give up. And you know what? They did not give up. If you lived in America at the beginning of 1932, the most familiar sound was not the radio or the whistle of trains, but silence. A heavy, dense kind of silence pressing down like a leaden sky on the heart. Cities no longer echoed with hurried footsteps. Rural towns no longer buzzed with plows tearing through the earth. All that remained was the wind passing through shuttered storefronts and the creak of rocking chairs in houses darkened by power cuts. People waited not for miracles, but for something real, a voice that knew how to listen. Herbert Hoover, the president at the time, was not a cruel man. He deeply believed in the core values of America: self-reliance, discipline, the spirit of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. But as the storm swept through families and towns, his calls to be patient and fend for yourselves began to feel cold. He said Americans should believe in voluntary charity, that churches and local organizations would care for the poor, that government intervention would breed dependence. But outside, the lines of people in the freezing cold were collapsing not from lack of faith, but from lack of bread. And faith, like the stomach, can only hold out for so long. That summer, a quiet march began toward the Capitol. They were not protesters. They were not soldiers. They were men who had already sacrificed for the nation, veterans of the First World War. They pitched tents along the banks of the Anacostia River, bringing families faded war photos and one unfulfilled promise, a government bonus pledged for 1945. But they could not wait 13 more years. They needed milk rice medicine right now. They were called the Bonus Army. It was a scene both noble and heartbreaking. Over 20,000 people lived in makeshift tent cities. They maintained order, took turns standing guard, and even set up schools for their children. They did not shout. They simply waited. But Hoover, the man of self-reliance, refused to listen. When the Senate rejected the bill for early payment, the president gave the order, dismantle the camp. And so, on a July night in 1932, federal troops under the command of General Douglas MacArthur advanced on the tents. Tanks, cavalry, bayonets, tear gas. A nation had turned its army on those who had once bled for its flag. Flames rose. Children screamed in panic. The elderly were shoved to the ground. Newspapers captured every moment American soldiers in full armor burning down the tents of unarmed veterans. The country was stunned. No one heard the government's justifications anymore. What they saw was betrayal. All across America, quiet rage erupted. People named the slums Hoovervilles. Empty pockets became Hoover flags, and the cardboard used to patch worn-out shoes was called Hoover leather. These were not jokes. They were the language of despair. In November of that year, a man stepped onto the stage with a gentle smile, eyes that listened, and a whispered promise. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His voice was warm like fire in the night, not arrogant, not ornate, just full of faith. And he brought with him something America had not seen in 3 long years, a plan. When FDR took the oath of office in March of 1933, he did not wait. In his first 100 days, he did what no president had dared before he shut down every bank in the nation. A nationwide bank holiday to halt the panic and rebuild trust. Soon after, when the banks reopened, the lines outside were not for withdrawals, but for deposits. A strange wave swept across the country hope. And then the name began to appear everywhere. The New Deal. A new contract with the American people. A voice rose from the ruins, not shouting, not rushing to shake hands, just telling the truth and refusing to leave anyone behind in the dark. That was how a nation began to rise again through trust, rekindled in the midst of silence. A misty morning in Appalachia. Scattered along the hillside were shacks made of burlap and scrap wood. Children ran barefoot, faces smudged with coal and dirt. A father, once a coal miner, now sat on the porch steps, hands gripping a shovel with no earth left to dig. There was no sound but the wind and the heavy breath of another day passing, another day without a single penny earned. And yet, that day, a stranger arrived in the village. He wore no suit, rode no horse, just a khaki jacket and a notebook in hand. He offered no promises, asked no empty questions. He came with work. And unexpectedly, that work became salvation. The New Deal. At first, just 2 words in a speech by President Roosevelt. But over time, it became something real, a quiet light slipping through the cracked doors of millions of American homes. When Roosevelt spoke of the New Deal, he did not mean money falling from the sky. He meant rebuilding the country with hands that had almost given up. From the poorest neighborhoods in New York to the bare plains of Nebraska, programs began to appear. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, put hundreds of thousands of unemployed young men into forests, mountains, and national parks. They planted trees, carved trails, built dams, not to escape hunger, but to restore pride. At a CCC camp in the Smoky Mountains, a young man wrote home to his mother, "For the first time, I can send money back, not ask for it." The Works Progress Administration, WPA, hired not just laborers, but also artists, writers, and musicians. In a small Indiana town, a WPA painter covered the post office wall with images of local farmers, not glamorous, but true. A woman stood before the mural and whispered, "For the first time, I see someone like me on a wall. The Social Security Act of 1935. America's first promise that the elderly would not be abandoned, that the unemployed would not be forgotten. It did not erase poverty, but it allowed people to imagine an old age that was not marked by desperation. At the center of this great wave was a familiar voice, FDR on the radio, his fireside chats reaching every rooftop, every farm, every crumbling apartment. He did not speak like a politician, but like a neighbor sitting beside you in a dark kitchen. I know you are afraid. I have been too. But we will get through this not by miracles, but by bricks, by pennies, by hours of work. All of America listened. But the most memorable thing was not the numbers or the legislation. It was the feeling people began to move again. A father rebuilt the wooden fence around his vegetable garden because he had work again. An elderly woman pulled out a half-finished embroidery, no longer forced to choose between thread and bread. Crumbling walls were repaired. Dirt roads stretched further. America began to breathe again, not in great gasps, but steadily, like a heart recovering after a heart attack. Yet no one romanticized reality. The pain was still there, and it was not equally shared. People of color, women immigrants, too often were left out of the New Deal's embrace. They worked, they contributed, but they were not always treated fairly. Some programs never reached their communities or arrived late and lacking. FDR was not a perfect savior, but he was the first to say out loud that injustice was real and that the responsibility belonged to everyone. When you step outside one morning and see a bridge crossing a small river, a park where children laugh, or a solid red brick building standing at the heart of town, remember many of those structures were not built with money alone, but with the slow rebuilding of trust. Because the New Deal did not just reconstruct a nation, it restored belief in the very idea of a nation. You see, sometimes what people need most is not relief, but a reason to rise a chance to be needed. And perhaps in those darkest years, the greatest miracle was not Roosevelt nor the government budget, but the American people choosing not to let the darkness define them. They chose to carry on. They chose to rebuild. They chose to believe. When a ship changes direction in the middle of the ocean, you can hear the metal groan, a sound of gravity being defied, of momentum being forced to surrender. America in the mid-1930s was much like that ship. Roosevelt had placed his hand on the wheel. He had set it in motion. But not everyone wanted to go where he was steering, because no reform, no matter how necessary, comes without making someone angry. At first, the opposition was just whispers, but before long it turned into heavy knocks at the doors of newspaper offices, boardrooms of tycoons, church pulpits, and radio stations. The wealthy and the powerful, those who had long treated America like a chessboard where they held the kings, began to worry. To them, the New Deal was nothing short of a quiet revolution. Laws like Social Security, labor protections, and steep taxes on the wealthy, these were not salvation. To them, they were brutal intrusions on freedom, the first steps down a road to socialism. Some newspapers called Roosevelt a dictator in a three-piece suit. They drew him as a puppet master, gripping the economy with one hand and dragging America into communism with the other. But what made FDR truly formidable was not his power. It was the people's support. Of course, criticism did not come only from conservatives. From the other side came a different wave of resistance, not because Roosevelt had done too much, but because he had not done enough. Huey Long, the senator from Louisiana, was a political whirlwind. With fiery speeches and lightning in his eyes, he championed the Share Our Wealth program. He demanded heavy taxes on the ultra-rich, guaranteed income for every family, free housing, free education. Crowds gathered in public squares to hear him as if listening to a prophet. No one needs millions of dollars while millions have not a single bed to sleep in. Huey Long threatened Roosevelt's administration not with weapons, but with the power of desperation. Had he not been assassinated in 1935, history might have taken a very different path. Another name echoed through national radio waves: Father Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest with a voice like a spell. At first, he supported Roosevelt. But when the administration began cooperating with major banks, he called FDR a tool of Wall Street. Coughlin did not just channel the anger of working people, he also fueled hatred, especially through dangerous anti-Semitic rhetoric. Through his broadcasts, the radio was no longer the soundtrack of hope. It became a loudspeaker for collective rage. And then came the Supreme Court. In 1935, a string of decisions stunned Roosevelt. The justices declared several cornerstone programs of the New Deal unconstitutional. FDR struck back immediately. He proposed a bold and controversial plan: expand the number of justices, a move the press dubbed court packing. He failed. But slowly the court began to shift subtly. They started to support the reforms that followed. Amid all the opposing voices, Roosevelt stood firm. Not because he could not hear the shouting, but because he chose to listen to the silent ones. The man returning to the construction site with a pickaxe. The widow receiving her first government check. The small farmer clutching a relief contract with trembling hands, never having seen his name on an official document before. And then, from the dusty corners of poverty, a quiet wave of art began to rise. Photographers of the Farm Security Administration like Dorothea Lange wandered through ghost towns capturing the faces of survival. A mother sitting inside a tattered tent, children clinging to her sides, her eyes lost in the distance. That photo migrant mother became a symbol not only of suffering, but of dignity. John Steinbeck picked up his pen and wrote, "The Grapes of Wrath," not a novel, but a hymn for forgotten souls. Writers from the Federal Writers Project dug through memory, recording the stories of those who had once been enslaved, who had wandered, who had loved, who had starved. For the first time, the government paid people to tell stories as if it were trying to listen to its own history. You see, it was not only policy that could transform a nation. It was storytelling, honest, gentle, and brave, that kept America from forgetting who it was. Under waves of criticism, the New Deal did not collapse. It endured not as a perfect victory, but as a clumsy yet sincere stitch across America's fractured heart. And sometimes, survival itself is the greatest political act. A piece of music began to rise, not the lively jazz of the roaring 20s, nor the romantic violin drifting from a tea-room window, but a quiet symphony of sighs of hammers, striking rooftops being rebuilt of brooms, sweeping dust in libraries reopened after years of silence. A song woven from survival, and its final movement, like all great symphonies, did not end with a bang, but with a pause. Amid the ruins of the crisis in alleys once lined with soup lines, something miraculous was slowly unfolding. Not a sudden recovery, not a financial miracle, but life returning. Bit by bit, like a late spring after a winter far too long. Folk songs once thought fit only for poor taverns now echoed in union halls. Woody Guthrie slung his guitar etched with the words, "This machine kills fascists," and sang about the land, the dust, and resilience. Songs like "This Land is Your Land" were not just lyrics, they were reminders that America did not belong only to those at the top, but also to those who had knelt from hunger. At the movie theater, people lined up for tickets, even if they could not afford dinner, because for a few cents they could step into another world where Fred Astaire danced past every sorrow, where Charlie Chaplin made audiences laugh through tears, where a little girl named Dorothy wandered into Oz, reminding everyone that no matter how far we roam home is where the heart returns. Art in those years was not a luxury, but a necessity for the soul. By the end of the 1930s, Americans were slowly finding work again. Those who had lost homes were now helping build schools, bridges, and dams. But no one dared say, "We are fine now," because the shadow of crisis still lingered. And then came the war. Europe erupted in flames in 1939. At first, America watched an uneasy spectator. But then came the explosion at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and everything changed. Factories that had stood silent during the Great Depression now roared to life, producing guns, tanks, ships. Men went off to war. Women entered the factories, hands covered in grease-red bandanas tied in their hair. Rosie the Riveter was not just an icon, but a quiet revolution in womanhood. World War II paradoxically pulled America out of the Great Depression in ways policy alone could not. Jobs returned. Money returned. But the lessons remained etched into the heart of a generation. And here is what I hope you carry with you as you turn off the light tonight. The Great Depression was not only an economic tragedy, it was a moral lesson. It taught us. Prosperity without fairness is a foundation built on sand. Trust not gold is what holds a society together. And government is not a distant machine. It is a mirror of ourselves. It can be cold, or it can be kind. The generation that survived that storm is not remembered for winning, but for not giving up. They had no technology, no social media to cry for help. Only their hands, their pride, and a will that refused to break. A father kept lining up for work even after being turned away 10 times. A mother made thin soup for 4 children and still smiled. A child tucked their college dream into an old notebook, believing that someday school would start again. They lived as if their very existence was the quietest yet deepest form of defiance. And we, sitting here in the 21st century with all the comforts and uncertainties of our own age, what can we learn? That there will always be moments when markets crash, trust falters, and the future grows dim. But each time, history quietly whispers, "This is not the first time." And if we choose to listen, we will remember how those before us moved forward, not with panic, but with unity, courage, and faith that tomorrow can be better if we build it with our own hands. The wind that once blew across dust-covered fields now carries the scent of new seedlings. The bell of an old train station once welcoming hungry children seeking work now rings as their grandchildren return to visit home. And the voice of history, not loud, not boastful, simply rests a hand on your shoulder in the middle of the night and says, "Live, try, and remember you are not alone." An old story, but never out of date.